The notice came on a torn piece of printed paper. Not a digital alert. Not a priority signal pushed through the station's comm grid. Just a flat, yellowed sheet of printed text slid under the dock door of Bay 7 at Colburn's Rest, the way old landlords used to leave eviction warnings in the stories Darren Holt's grandfather used to tell. He peeled it off the floor, read it once, then read it again. The Coalition Port Authority was giving him 30 days to either repair the Candor to Class C standards or surrender her for decommissioning. Darren folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he walked to the edge of the dock and looked at his ship. The Candor sat in Bay 7 the way an old dog sits in the sun low, a little crooked, not quite symmetrical, but comfortable in her own shape. Her hull had been patched so many times that the original color was basically a theory at this point. 3 different shades of gray competed across her exterior plating. The rear stabilizer on the port side had a slight downward lean that Darren had compensated for in the NAV settings so long ago that he no longer noticed it. The cockpit viewport had a hairline crack sealed with resin that had slightly yellowed over time, which gave the outside world a faint amber tint from the pilot's seat. She was not pretty. She was not impressive. She was, by every Coalition standard, a liability. Darren loved her completely. He was 39 years old, human, and had been flying salvage routes on the fringe of Coalition space for 11 years. In that time, he had recovered 17 derelict vessels, 42 cargo loads, and 1 very confused alien passenger who had been locked inside a refrigeration pod for 6 weeks and was deeply unhappy about it. He had never missed a contract deadline. He had never lost a recovered load. He had a reputation, not a glamorous one, but solid. In the salvage world, solid was worth more than glamorous. The problem was that the salvage world did not care much about reputation when a Port Authority inspector stood in your bay, ran a scan on your ship, and made a sound like he had stepped in something unpleasant. That had been 3 weeks ago. The inspector, a tall Valori with silver-gray skin and the expression of someone who had given up being surprised by human choices, had walked a full circle around the Candor with a handheld scanner and produced a list of 41 technical deficiencies. Darren had read the list. He had then respectfully pointed out that 23 of those deficiencies were the result of modifications he had made himself, that all 23 were functional improvements over the original factory spec, and that the inspector was welcome to come aboard and test any of them. The inspector had declined and filed the report anyway. Now Darren had 30 days and a paper notice. He went inside. The Candor's interior was narrow and practical. The main corridor ran from the airlock to the cockpit with 2 small side cabins and a cramped engineering bay. Every surface had something attached to it: coiled cables, spare parts and magnetic clips, sealed containers of fuel compound, tools. It looked cluttered. It was cluttered, but Darren could find anything in under 20 seconds because he knew exactly where everything was. "You read it," said a voice from the cockpit. It was not a human voice. It was flat and slightly metallic, the way voices sound when they come from a speaker that was never designed for warmth. SOVI was the Candor's AI system, or more precisely, SOVI was what remained of 3 different AI cores that Darren had merged into one after the original navigation system failed 5 years ago. The result was something that no AI manufacturer would recognize as their product and no Coalition technician would certify as stable. But SOVI worked. More than worked. SOVI thought, in the way that surprised you sometimes. "They want the ship," Darren said, dropping into the pilot's seat. "They want the ship gone," SOVI said. "There is a difference. One implies value. The other implies inconvenience. 30 days. I heard. I read it before you did. The paper was blocking my external door sensor." Darren leaned back and looked at the cracked viewport and the amber tint it gave the dock outside. A pair of the lorry cargo loaders were moving a container stacked 2 bays over. Neither of them looked at the Candor. No one ever really looked at the Candor unless they had to. "There's a contract," Darren said. "Posted this morning. Coalition, open salvage. Riven expanse. Recovery and survey. The payout is listed as provisional, but the base rate is." "I know the contract," SOVI said. "I flagged it 4 hours ago, and then unflagged it because I assumed you would find a reason not to consider it seriously." "What reason?" "The Riven expanse destroys ships. It destroys Coalition ships," Darren said. "Their NAV systems can't handle the interference. Everything talks to everything else, And when the gravitational fields start breaking the signal chains, the whole system locks up. It's not the expanse that kills them. It's the fact that they built everything to work perfectly in conditions that aren't perfect. Sophie was quiet for a moment. And we, it said, are not built to work perfectly. We are built to work, Darren said. There's a difference. He went to the port terminal and pulled up the coalition contract listing. The Riven Expanse had been a closed zone for 11 years. Before that, it had swallowed 6 survey missions and 3 military escorts. The coalition had declared it non-navigable and moved on. The open contract was a formality, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that anything recovered from the Expanse would be bought at premium rate. Nobody was expected to try. Darren filed an application. The response came back in 40 minutes. Not a rejection, they couldn't outright reject an open contract filing. But attached to the acceptance confirmation was a mandatory in-person briefing requirement. Darren recognized the move. It was the kind of administrative courtesy that existed to tell you something to your face that paperwork could not. He walked to the coalition offices at the center of Colburn's Rest. The building was clean and tall and smelled faintly of recycled air and the lorry cleaning solution. A receptionist directed him to a briefing room where Commander Ural was already waiting. Ural was coalition military, attached to the fringe station as a logistics officer. He was not a bad man in any dramatic sense. He was simply the kind of person who had organized his understanding of the universe into neat categories a long time ago and had not seen sufficient reason to reorganize since. Humans were in a category. That category was labeled, in the quiet part of his thinking, with something close to pity. He looked at Darren the way the Port Authority inspector had looked at the candor. "We received your application," Ural said. "We are required to process it. We are also required, in the interest of coalition member safety, to inform you that no vessel matching the candor specifications has ever successfully navigated the Riven Expanse, and that the probability of—" "I read the reports," Darren said. Ural paused. "Then you understand the risk." "I understand the risk to coalition vessels with coalition navigation systems," Darren said. "My ship doesn't have coalition navigation systems. My ship has 3 mismatched cores running independent calculations that don't talk to each other unless I make them. In a field that breaks synchronized signals, that's not a weakness." Ural looked at him for a long moment. There was no hostility in the look. That was almost worse. It was the look of a person hearing something they had already decided was not worth the effort of understanding. "The contract is valid," Ural said finally. "You may proceed. We will not be sending assistance." "Didn't ask for any," Darren said. He walked back to Bay 7. He told Sophie to run a full systems check. He packed 2 weeks of supplies, checked the fuel compound mixture twice, and resealed the cockpit viewport resin where it had started to lift at one corner. Then Darren Holt flew the candor out of Colburn's Rest and pointed her nose toward the Riven Expanse. Behind him, the station lights shrank to a single bright point and then disappeared entirely. Ahead, the stars looked different, denser, heavier somehow, like they were pressed together by something enormous and invisible. Sophie spoke quietly. "No one is watching us go." "Good," Darren said. "Less to explain when we come back." The first thing the Riven Expanse did was kill the lights. Not all of them. Not in a dramatic way. The overhead strip in the main corridor flickered twice and then settled at about half brightness, like a tired eye half closing. The external sensor array on the candor's dorsal spine began throwing mismatched readings, 2 sensors arguing with a third, all 3 reading the same field differently. The fuel flow monitor showed a number, then a different number, then the first number again, cycling slowly. Darren watched all of this and did not touch anything. He had learned a long time ago that the first instinct in a failing system was to start pressing buttons. It felt like action. It felt like control. Most of the time it made things worse because you were adding input to a system that was already confused about what inputs it was receiving. So he watched. He let the candor tell him what she was doing before he tried to tell her what to do. Sophie was running calculations. The sound of it was a low, irregular hum from the overhead speaker, not words yet, just processing noise. Sophie only made that sound when it was doing something genuinely hard. They had been inside the Expanse for 6 hours. The Riven Expanse was not a single thing. It was a region roughly 8 light hours across at its widest point, where several overlapping gravitational sources created a field that was never stable in any one direction. The sources were old, dead things, the remnants of a stellar collapse that had happened long before the Coalition existed, long before any recorded spaceflight. The collapse had not been clean. It had left behind a web of micro-dense points scattered through the region like seeds and fruit, each one pulling slightly, none of them pulling in agreement, all of them together creating a field that shifted and folded and pressed against any object moving through it. What this did to Coalition ships was simple and brutal. Coalition navigation relied on a network of synchronized systems: drive control, talking to NAV grid, talking to stabilizer array, talking to sensor suite. All of them shared a common signal clock. In normal space, this was efficient and elegant. In the expanse, the gravitational interference broke the signal clock within hours. Once the clock was broken, the synchronized systems started receiving data at different rates. They disagreed with each other. They began issuing contradictory corrections. The ship tried to follow all of them at once and tore itself apart or locked up entirely. The Candor had no signal clock. She had never had one. The original navigation core had used one, but that core had failed 5 years ago. What Darren had built in its place was 3 separate cores from 3 different manufacturers, running 3 different operating architectures. They did not share a clock because they could not. Their architectures were incompatible at the base level. Each one calculated on its own. Each one gave Darren a reading. Darren looked at all 3 and made the call himself. It was slow. It was not elegant. It was the kind of system that a Coalition engineer would look at and feel a physical discomfort, the way a person feels discomfort looking at a wall with a crooked picture frame. But in a field that broke synchronized signals, nothing broke. There was nothing synchronized to break. The lights came back up fully after another hour. The sensors settled into their separate readings. Darren cross-referenced them manually, noted where they agreed and where they differed, and drew his own picture of the space around them from the overlap. It was like listening to 3 people describe the same room from different corners and building a map from what all 3 could see. Gravitational variance is increasing, Sovi said. The processing hum was gone. Sovi sounded, as much as it ever sounded like anything, alert. We are approaching the first dense cluster. The field will fold in approximately 40 minutes. Which direction? Starboard and below. If we hold course, the fold will press against the port stabilizer. The port stabilizer already has a lean. Yes, Sovi said. That is why I am telling you. Darren adjusted course manually, not with the automated heading system, which he had set to advisory only before entering the expanse, but with the physical yoke, the old-fashioned column that most Coalition ships had removed entirely because the automated systems were better in normal space. In the expanse, Darren wanted his hands on the ship. He wanted to feel the resistance, the slight shudder when the field pressed against the hull. You could not feel that through an automated correction. The ship just smoothly compensated, and you never knew how hard it was working until it stopped working. He brought the Candor 15 degrees to port and dropped the nose slightly. The field fold, when it came, rolled against the starboard side instead of the port. The hull groaned once, a deep, structural sound that traveled through the seat and into Darren's spine and then steadied. That was unpleasant, Sovi said. Could have been worse. Yes, the port stabilizer could have sheared. They flew in silence for a while. The expanse outside was not dark exactly. There was a faint luminescence from the gravitational distortion itself, a blue-gray shimmer at the edges of vision that was not quite light and not quite nothing. It made the space around them look like the inside of a storm cloud seen from within. Occasionally a piece of debris, old rock, the remnant of something that had been here for 1,000,000 years, drifted past at angles that made no sense from a normal orbital physics standpoint. Everything in the expanse moved according to rules that were technically correct but felt wrong. Darren had been inside twice before, briefly, on the outer edges. He had never gone deep. He was deep now. On the second day, a stabilizer coupling on the starboard engine housing cracked. He knew it before any sensor told him. There was a vibration in the throttle that had not been there before, not the field, which had its own rhythm he was starting to learn, but something mechanical, something physical. He pulled the throttle back, locked the autopilot on the advisory heading, and went back to the engine housing with a light and a tool kit. The crack was clean, which was good. It had not sheared through, just fractured under the stress of the field press. He had 2 spare couplings. He pulled the fractured one, seated the replacement, torqued it by hand, and then with the driver, and checked it twice. The whole repair took 40 minutes. Sophie maintained the heading. When Darren came back to the cockpit, Sophie said, "A coalition engineering assessment would have flagged that as a required dry dock repair." "Good thing we're not in dry dock," Darren said. "Good thing," Sophie agreed. On the third day, Sophie picked up the signal. It came in on a band that the Cander's old receiver array was still tuned to an emergency frequency that the Coalition had deprecated 11 years ago when they updated their communication standards. The new standard was cleaner, faster, more efficient. The old band was considered background noise now, and most modern systems filtered it out automatically. The Cander's receiver was not modern. It had never been updated because the update required a system overhaul that Darren had never had money for. So the old band played in the background, constant static, unlistened to, until Sophie, running a wide scan to map the region's interference patterns, passed across that frequency and stopped. "Darren." Something in the way Sophie said it made him sit up. "There is a signal on the deprecated emergency band. It is looping. It is on a 47-second cycle. It is." Sophie paused, and this was unusual because Sophie did not pause without reason. "It is human format. Coalition Colonist Registration Code, pre-update standard. The origin identifier reads as Settlement Designation Farhold." Darren did not say anything for a moment. Farhold. He knew the name the way everyone who had grown up in fringe space knew it, not as history exactly, more as a story that adults told without quite finishing. A colony ship that went into the expanse 60 years ago. For 1,000 people. Never came back. The Coalition had searched the outer edge for 2 years, and then quietly closed the file. Gone. Everyone assumed gone. "Play it," Darren said. The signal was mostly static with a clean pulse beneath it. The pulse carried an identifier code and a single repeated phrase in standard human communication format, a distress loop. Automated. The kind of thing a settlement beacon transmitted when the people who set it up were no longer there to up. Darren listened to the loop 3 times. Then he pulled up the NAV display and began calculating the signal's origin point. "The salvage contract," Sophie said carefully. "Forget the salvage contract. Darren." "If there are people alive in there," Darren said, "we are going to find them. The contract can wait. The Coalition can wait. Everything can wait." Sophie was quiet. Then, "The signal origin is approximately 11 hours deeper into the expanse. The field density increases significantly in that direction. The probability of structural damage to the ship." "I heard you. I want to be certain." "I heard you," Darren said again more quietly. "Set the heading." The Candor turned deeper into the riven expanse, toward a signal that had been calling into the dark for 60 years, and for the first time in all of that time, something was finally close enough to hear it. It started as a smudge. On the Candor's forward sensor display, deep in the riven expanse where nothing was supposed to exist except old rock and older silence, a shape resolved slowly out of the gravitational noise. Not a ship, not a natural formation either. Something built the straight lines and flat planes that nature does not make. Darren leaned forward in his seat and watched it grow from a smudge to an outline to something he could name. An asteroid, roughly 2 kilometers at its longest axis, and inside it threw it light. Pale and steady. The kind of light that comes from a power source that has been running for a very long time and has learned to be careful about how much it uses. Farhold. He knew it before any confirmation came through. He knew it the way you know something, when every quiet part of your brain assembles the answer before the loud part has finished asking the question. Sophie confirmed it a moment later. "Settlement identifier matches the beacon code. I am reading thermal output consistent with habitation. Internal power generation. Multiple heat signatures. Darren, there are a significant number of heat signatures." "How many?" "The asteroid's density is limiting the scan resolution, but the thermal spread is not consistent with a small group. This is a population." The docking approach took 2 hours because Darren did not know the local field patterns around the asteroid, and he was not going to rush. He brought the Candor in slowly, reading the field as he went, letting the ship tell him where the resistance was and correcting by hand. The asteroid had a natural rotation that was slow and steady. On its far side, cut into the rock, was a docking bay, old design, human design, with a manual beacon light that was blinking in a pattern Darren recognized from early Coalition colonist documentation. It was the standard arrival signal request that colony ships used 60 years ago. It meant, "We see you. Come in slow, identify yourself." He broadcast his identification on the old human emergency band. His name, his ship's name, the word human. The bay doors opened. Inside, the lights were on. There were people standing on the dock when the Cander's landing gear touched down. Darren counted 12 of them before he stopped counting, because the number did not matter yet. What mattered was that they were upright, clothed, not panicked, not desperate in their faces. They were looking at the Cander the way people look at something they have been waiting for so long that the actual arrival has temporarily broken their ability to react normally. Still, quiet, eyes wide. Darren came down the boarding ramp alone. He had left his jacket in the cockpit. He stood in the bay in a plain gray work shirt and looked at the 12 people, and they looked at him. A man at the front of the group stepped forward. He was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that lands differently in a person who has worked hard all their life. His hair was white and close-cut, his face deeply lined, his hands large and steady. He walked with a slight forward lean, the posture of someone who had spent decades moving through low-clearance spaces. He stopped 2 meters from Darren and looked at him for a long moment. "Human," the old man said. "Yes," Darren said. The old man's face did something complicated. Several things passed across it in quick succession: relief, grief, something that might have been anger or might have been the shape grief takes when it has been held too long. Then it settled into something quieter. "I'm Morrow," he said. "I run this place. Have for about 30 years now. Darren Holt. I came in on a salvage contract. I found your beacon." Morrow nodded slowly. "We never turned it off. Some of the younger ones thought we should. I said no." He paused. "I said no every year." They shook hands. Morrow's grip was firm. What followed was several hours of conversation, food that was simple and slightly unusual in flavor from 60 years of adapted cultivation, and a gradual, layered understanding of what Farhold had become. The colony ship had entered the expanse under orders from the early Coalition Expansion Authority, following a mapped corridor that had turned out to be badly surveyed. The corridor collapsed within weeks, not destroyed, simply unstable, the gravitational pattern shifting enough to make the return path impassable. They had tried to signal. The signals had not gotten out. They had waited for rescue. Rescue had not come. So they had built. The asteroid had been their shelter first, and then their home. They had drilled and carved and pressurized. They had grown food in chambers lit by arrays that used the gravitational differential of the nearby dense points to generate a consistent power output, something no Coalition engineer had ever tried because it required working with the expanse rather than against it. They had built their own communication systems, their own tools, their own medical practices. They had developed their own methods for reading the field patterns and navigating the local area safely. 60 years. For 1,000 original colonists, now 11,000 people. Bryn found Darren in the second hour. She was young mid-20s, with the direct energy of someone who has grown up in a place where there is always more work than time. She walked up to the Cander while Darren was still eating, ran one hand along the hull with the careful attention of a person who knows how materials feel under stress, and then looked at Darren with sharp, specific interest. "Your ship is incredible," she said. Darren had heard many things said about the Cander. Incredible was not one of the frequent ones. "You're the engineer?" he guessed. "One of them. Bryn. I was born here." She was already looking at the engine housing. "Is that a hybrid compound feed on the port drive? I have never seen that configuration in any documentation we have." "I made it up," Darren said. "It works." "You watch me land." She almost smiled. "I want to see your NAV cores." He let her in. While Morrow continued a long, careful conversation with Darren about the history of the colony, Bryn moved through the Cander with a handheld scanner and a notebook, recording things. She asked questions in a focused, rapid way and did not waste words. Sovi responded to her questions directly, which Sovi did not typically do with strangers, and Darren noticed this, but said nothing. Then Morrow told him about the asteroid. The core was destabilizing. Not rapidly, not catastrophically, but measurably, consistently, and irreversibly. A natural process, the same gravitational forces that had powered Farhold for 60 years, now slowly working on the rock itself. Their own geologists had been tracking it for 12 years. The estimate, updated regularly, gave them 14 months before the internal structure of the settlement became unsafe. After that, the asteroid would not collapse, it would simply become impossible to maintain pressurization and structural integrity in the inhabited sections. 11,000 people. 14 months. No way out. They had no ships capable of leaving the expanse. The technology they had built was excellent for surviving inside it, but they had never had the materials or the mass to construct an interstellar vessel. They had sent small automated probes over the years. Most were destroyed by the field before they got far. A few had made it to the expanse's edge. There was no way to know if any signal they carried had reached anyone. Darren sat with this for a moment. Then he asked Morrow about the field patterns they had mapped over 60 years. Morrow led him to the colony's data center, a room deep in the rock, cool and quiet, lined with storage systems that were a generation behind current coalition standards, but clearly maintained with intense care. 60 years of observation. Field behavior logged daily, across seasons, across the slow cycles of the dense gravitational points. Dozens of stable micro-corridors identified and mapped narrow paths where the field folded in predictable, manageable ways. Darren looked at the data for a long time. Coalition ships could not use those corridors. The corridors were too narrow for vessels with automated NAV systems. The field variance within the corridor was still too high for synchronized systems to handle safely. But for a ship flying on independent cores, navigated by hand by someone who had learned in the past 3 days to read the field by feel. He thought about the Cander's 3 mismatched cores. He thought about Bryn's questions about the NAV architecture. Elder Morrow, Darren said, I am going back out. I am going to get help. I am going to come back with ships. Morrow looked at him steadily. Coalition ships cannot come through the expanse. Not standard ones, Darren said. But I have an idea about that. And your corridor maps are most of the idea. Morrow was quiet for a moment. Then he went to a separate storage unit and removed a physical data core, a sealed, hardened unit the size of Darren's fist. He turned it over in his large hands once, then held it out. 60 years, Morrow said. Everything we learned. Everything we built. Everything we lost. And everything we kept. It is all on there. His voice was steady. If you do not come back, I need someone to know that we were here. That we did not simply disappear. Darren took the core. I'll come back, he said. Morrow looked at him the way old people look at young people when they make promises not without faith, but with the knowledge of what promises cost. I believe you mean that, Morrow said. Bryn was waiting by the boarding ramp with a small case of components she had pulled from her own workshop. She looked at Darren without asking permission and said, I modified the signal buffer on your forward core. It should hold the field reading steady 4 seconds longer before it resets. It is a small thing, but in the corridors it will matter. Darren looked at the component case. You did this in 2 hours? I work fast, Bryn said, not as a boast. Simply as information. He nodded. He took the case aboard. He told Sovi to spin up the drives. The bay doors opened, and the Candor lifted back out into the pale shimmer of the expanse. Behind him, 11,000 people waited in the only home they had ever known, in a rock that was slowly deciding it was done. Ahead of him was the long, punishing path back out through the riven expanse, and after that, a coalition that had not thought about Farhold in 60 years and was going to need convincing. Darren flew. Nobody clapped when the Candor docked at Colburn's Rest. There was no gathering crowd, no signal alert from the Port Authority, no indication that anything had changed since Darren had left 11 days ago. Bay 7 was exactly as he had left it. The same scuff marks on the floor plates. The same flickering overhead strip on the far wall that the maintenance crew had been meaning to fix for 4 months. A new layer of station dust had settled on the Candor's exterior, which meant she looked roughly the same as always, just marginally worse. Darren walked off the boarding ramp, stood in his bay, and felt the particular disorientation of returning from something enormous to a place that did not know anything enormous had happened. He had come out of the riven expanse 14 hours ago. The exit had been harder than the entry. The field had been in a compressed phase, which Sovi had not fully predicted, and the Candor had spent 3 hours working through a dense fold that pushed against the hull steadily, the way deep water pushes against a diving suit. Nothing had broken. The port stabilizer had complained. He had told it to be quiet, and it had obeyed, more or less. He carried Morrow's data core inside his jacket, against his ribs, the way people carry things they cannot afford to lose. The Coalition offices were a 20-minute walk from Bay 7. Darren did not stop for food or rest. He went directly. The receptionist told him Commander Ural was unavailable. Darren said he would wait. He sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes. The chairs were designed by someone who believed that comfort encouraged lingering, and were therefore uncomfortable in a very deliberate way. Darren sat in one and read through Farhold's corridor map data on his personal unit, going over the numbers he had been turning over in his head for the last 14 hours. Ural arrived looking like a man who had been told something mildly inconvenient. "You came back," Ural said, with the specific inflection of a person who had not quite expected that. "I found the colony," Darren said. "Farhold. 11,000 people. Alive. I have documentation, sensor logs, recorded testimony, and a full data package from the colony itself. They are alive, and they need evacuation. The asteroid they are living in has approximately 14 months before it is no longer habitable." Ural stood in the waiting room doorway and looked at Darren with an expression that moved through several stages. The first stage was the standard skeptical face. The second was something more careful, the face of a man doing political arithmetic in his head. "Come to the briefing room," Ural said. The next 3 hours were, in Darren's estimation, one of the more frustrating experiences of his life, and he had once spent 6 hours replacing a burst fuel line in a pressure suit while the ship it belonged to was slowly venting atmosphere. Ural took the report. He read it. He passed it to 2 staff officers who read it separately. There was a consultation Darren was not invited to. There was a communication sent to Coalition Central Station that Darren was told was routine. There was a second communication that Ural described as procedural. Darren sat in a chair on the corridor side of a closed door and waited. When the door opened again, Ural said, "We are concerned about verification. I gave you sensor logs. The Cander's sensors are not Coalition certified. Neither is the colony's existence, but it exists. There will need to be a formal verification mission before. There is no time for a verification mission at standard pace," Darren said, keeping his voice level with some effort. "The colony has 14 months. A formal verification mission at Coalition scheduling speed would take 4 to 6 months to authorize, which leaves you 8 months to plan an evacuation of 11,000 people from deep inside the Riven Expanse using ships that cannot navigate the Riven Expanse. That is not a plan. That is a countdown." Ural looked at him without expression. "The Coalition cannot commit vessels to a rescue operation in a non-navigable zone based on the word of a single unaffiliated human salvager and a set of uncertified sensor readings." Darren removed the data core from his jacket and set it on the table between them. "That is 60 years of Farhold's recorded data," he said. "Not my sensor readings. Theirs. 60 years of field observations from inside the Expanse, 60 years of engineering records, navigation data, and corridor maps for 18 stable micropaths through the Riven Expanse. They mapped a way through. The corridors are narrow. Standard Coalition NAV systems cannot handle the residual variance. But a ship stripped of synchronized navigation and flown manually on independent cores can. I did it. I have the flight record." Ural looked at the core. He did not touch it. "I will forward this to the relevant department," he said. "Which department?" "Resource and Survey Analysis." Darren understood immediately what that meant. Resource and Survey Analysis was where information went to be studied, cataloged, assigned a project number, and placed in a queue. It was not where emergencies were handled. It was where interesting data was managed. He picked the core back up. "I will speak to the Valori diplomatic delegation," he said. Ural's expression tightened slightly. "That is not the standard escalation path." "No," Darren agreed, and left. The Valori delegation occupied a suite of offices on the upper level of the station's administrative block. They were not easy to get an appointment with. Darren sent a message through the formal request channel, and then, on a separate line, send a plain summary of Farhold's corridor data to the diplomatic suite's general contact address with a subject line that read, "Riven Expanse Navigation Stable Corridor Maps, 60 years of observational data." He got a response in 40 minutes. A meeting the following morning. Grant was the senior diplomat of the Valori delegation at Colburn's Rest. He was a pragmatist in the way that successful diplomats are pragmatists. He dealt in real currency, which was information and advantage, and he did not let preference cloud his accounting. He was not fond of humans as a category. Darren knew this before he walked in because everyone in fringe space knew it. The Delori considered humans industrious in the way that a complicated piece of machinery is industrious useful, but not an entity you particularly want to have a conversation with. Grant had read the corridor summary overnight. He did not say hello. He said, "How many stable corridors?" 18 mapped, 6 independently verified by multiple observation logs over different years, Darren said. The widest is approximately 400 meters of navigable length. Tight for a coalition mid-range vessel, but workable if the NAV architecture is modified. Modified how? Darren explained. He explained it the way he had explained the Kandar's 3 cores to Ural, but this time the person across the table was listening. Actually listening, in the way that changes the shape of the room. Grant asked questions that were... The conversation went on for 2 hours. The colony's data represents a navigational key to the Riven Expanse, Grant said finally. That region contains unmapped star systems, potential resource deposits, strategic positioning. He paused. The Coalition's interest in this data is substantial. The Coalition's interest in the data can be satisfied after 11,000 human citizens are evacuated, Darren said. Not before. The data and the people are not separate negotiations. They are one transaction. Grant looked at him. There was no warmth in the look, but there was something that might have been respect in its pure functional form, the acknowledgement of a position clearly stated by someone who understood its value. You are offering the full data package in exchange for a guaranteed evacuation, Grant said, and full Coalition citizenship restored to the Farhold colonists, with legal recognition backdated to the date of the colony's founding. That is a significant demand. It is a reasonable one. They are humans. They were Coalition citizens when they left. The Coalition did not rescue them. The least the Coalition can do is acknowledge that they existed. Grant was quiet for a long moment. What you are asking for is a political commitment that requires authorization above my level. I know, Darren said. I am asking you to make the case. You have read the data. You know what it is worth. The expanse opens up if this works. The corridors become navigable. Every system in that region becomes accessible. The far-old data is the price of entry into a zone the Coalition has given up on for 11 years. 11,000 human lives is a reasonable price for that. Grant looked at the data core on the table between them. Then he picked it up, not to keep to examine. He turned it over once, set it down. I will communicate this to Central Station, he said. I will recommend authorization. I cannot guarantee the outcome. I understand. If authorization is given, the evacuation plan will require your direct involvement. You are the only pilot with a flight record through the expanse. I know that too, Darren said. He walked back to Bay 7. Sophie asked how it had gone. Darren said they were waiting. Sophie said it had used the time to run a full diagnostic and had found 2 things that needed repair. Darren got his tools. He spent the afternoon with his hands inside the Kandar's guts, fixing what needed fixing, the way he always had. The answer from Coalition Central came back in 36 hours. Authorization granted. Evacuation plan approved in principle. A small fleet of modified vessels to be prepared. 1 human pilot, 1 human ship, to lead the crossing. Darren read the message twice. Then he told Sophie to start the pre-flight checks. There was a colony waiting. They gave him 3 ships and 9 days to prepare them. The ships were older Coalition mid-range transports, the kind of vessels that saw cargo duty on secondary routes and did not usually get asked to do anything remarkable. They were not warships. They were not survey vessels. They were, in the polite language of the authorization memo, assets identified as most suitable for modification given the structural and technical requirements of the mission. What this meant, translated out of bureaucratic softness, was that the Coalition was not willing to risk anything it considered valuable. Darren had expected this. The modification requirement was straightforward in concept and difficult in execution. Each ship needed its synchronized navigation network physically isolated, the common signal clock disconnected, the shared data bus severed between systems. Each core then had to be made to run independently, without attempting to reconcile its readings with the others. This was not how Coalition systems were designed. It took 3 engineers 2 full days just to understand the architecture well enough to begin. Darren worked alongside them. He did not tell them what to do. He showed them what had been done to the Candor over years of necessity and let them ask questions, which they did, many of them, and none of the questions were dismissive. These were working engineers with a practical problem. Practical problems had a way of cutting through assumptions faster than argument. He had sent a message to Farhold through the beacon band telling them to expect a fleet in approximately 2 weeks. He did not know if the message had gotten through. On the 5th day, Bryn's component modification, the one she had installed on the Candor's forward core before he had left, proved its value. Sobi demonstrated the 4-second extended reading window to the Coalition engineers using the Candor's sensor log from the first crossing. One of the engineers, a quiet Delori woman named Vel, studied the log for an hour and then asked Darren if she could attempt a version of the modification on the lead transport's core array. He said yes. She worked through the night. Her version was different from Bryn's, different architecture, different approach, but it produced a similar result. The reading window on the transport's primary core extended from less than a second to nearly 3. Vel did not comment on this with pride. She just moved on to the next problem. Darren appreciated that. The fleet departed on the 10th day. For ships in loose formation, the Candor at the front, the 3 transports behind its spacing that Darren specified. Not too close. The field variance would affect each ship slightly differently, depending on exact position, and he wanted maneuvering room. He had given each transport's captain a set of hand instructions for navigating inside the expanse written by Darren himself, in plain language, with diagrams. Not programming. Not automated guidelines. Physical paper that a human hand had written down, because in the expanse, paper did not fail. He did not know how many of the captains had read it carefully. He hoped all of them. The expanse received them with its usual indifference. Within 4 hours, the field had disrupted the inter-ship communication link. This was expected. Darren had set up a backup system before departure, a simple, old-fashioned radio relay on a tight beam frequency that the gravitational interference could not entirely suppress, because it did not rely on the precision signal chains that the field attacked. It was slow. It carried voice only, no data. It was enough. "Candor, this is Transport 1, said a voice over the relay. Formal, slightly clipped. The captain's name was Oren of the Lorry, experienced, professional. "We are reading field pressure on the portside hull. Variance is higher than the pre-mission projections. Hold your heading," Darren said. "It will peak in about 12 minutes, and then drop. If you correct into it, you'll be fighting the peak instead of letting it pass." A pause. Understood. The peak came and went. Transport 1 held heading. On the 2nd day, the Candor's starboard sensor array lost half its resolution due to a component that had been borderline before the first crossing and had finally decided it was done. Darren rerouted the load to the portside array and flew with asymmetric sensor coverage for 6 hours until the field shifted enough to make the repair safe without the risk of a loose hand tool becoming a small missile. He made the repair. He flew on. He navigated by the corridor maps Farhold had provided. The corridors were real. He had confirmed 2 of them on his first crossing, but now, with the maps, he could see the full network. The expanse was not random chaos. It was complex. But complex things had patterns, and the colonists of Farhold had spent 60 years learning this particular pattern with nothing else to do, and no one coming to rescue them from the necessity of understanding it. On the 3rd day, Transport 2 had its crisis. It happened in a gravitational shear zone, a place where 2 of the dense points were close enough that their fields created a band of opposing pressure between them. On the corridor map, this band was marked, and the safe path through it was a narrow line that required the ship to enter at a specific angle and hold that angle precisely for approximately 90 seconds while the field pushed against it from both sides. Transport 2 entered 2 degrees off the correct angle. 2 degrees was nothing in normal space. In the shear zone, 2 degrees meant the field press was uneven, stronger on the starboard side, and the ship began to rotate slowly, not catastrophically, not a spin, just a slow, grinding drift away from the heading. If it continued, the rotation would push the ship out of the corridor and into the full shear zone on the port side, where the field press was heavy enough to stress the hull beyond its tolerance. "Transport 2, correct your angle," Darren said. "We are attempting correction. The automated stabilizer is." "Turn off the automated stabilizer," Darren said. It is fighting the field. Kill it and correct with the manual yoke. Now. A pause that lasted about 3 seconds, which was a long 3 seconds. Then, automated stabilizer offline. Correcting manually. The rotation slowed. Stopped. The ship realigned. It took about 40 seconds. The ship came through the shear zone on the correct heading, and Darren heard the quiet sound of someone on Transport 2's bridge exhaling very slowly over the open relay. "Thank you, Candor," the captain said. "Keep the stabilizer off until I tell you otherwise," Darren said. "In the shear zones, the field changes faster than the automated system can adapt. Your hands are faster." "Understood." There were 2 more shear zones on the route. Both transports that passed through them went in with stabilizers off and manual yokes in hand. Neither drifted. The crossing took 9 days. In that time, between the moments of navigation and repair and quiet tension, something was happening on the 3 transports that Darren was only partially aware of because he was busy. The crews, the lorry mostly, 2 Vandori officers on Transport 3, a mixed group, were watching the Candor. Not in the way that people watch a guide out of passive reliance. In the way that people watch something that is making them reassess a prior assumption, and they are not entirely comfortable with the reassessment, but they cannot stop it. The Candor broke things and fixed them. She flew in ways that should not have worked and worked. Her pilot talked about the field the way a person talks about a difficult but known neighborhood, not afraid of it, not reckless about it, just familiar with the specific ways it would try to cause problems and prepared to deal with those ways. There was no drama in it. There was just the quiet accumulation of competence, repeated over 9 days, in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, without performance. Sovi, on the 4th day, observed, "Transport 1's crew has stopped looking at our hull markings when they communicate with us." "What do you mean?" "When we first departed, the camera feed from their bridge showed them looking at our registration hull code when they opened comms. Like they were reminding themselves who they were talking to. They have stopped doing that." Darren thought about this. "They know who they're talking to now." "Yes," Sovi said. "That is what I mean." On the 9th day, the dense field began to thin. The readings evened out. The color of space shifted from the blue-gray shimmer of the expanse's interior to the flatter dark of open space. The distinction was real, something you could see rather than just measure. And then, growing from the sensor data into a shape on the display, and then into something visible through the viewport, the asteroid appeared. Farhold. The beacon light was still blinking. The bay doors, when Darren broadcast his identification, opened. What was waiting on the dock this time was not 12 people. It was several hundred, filling the bay and the corridors behind it, pressed carefully forward, not desperate, not a crush, but gathered. They had known the fleet was coming. The message had gotten through, and they had come to see it. Darren brought the Candor down and stepped off the boarding ramp, and the bay was very quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping. It spread, not loudly, not wildly, just steadily, the way sound spreads in a large stone room. Darren stood on the dock floor, and Morrow was walking through the crowd toward him with the same steady forward lean and the same large hands and the same lined face that now, Darren thought, looked more like relief than anything else. They shook hands again. "You came back," Morrow said. "Told you I would." Bryn appeared at Morrow's shoulder, already looking at the 3 coalition transports settling into their dock positions, already calculating. "We need to talk about loading configuration," she said. "I have been planning the distribution since your message came through. The children and the elderly should go first on Transport 1 and 2 because—" "Bryn," Morrow said quietly. She stopped. "Give it a moment," he said. She looked at Darren. Then she looked at the 3 large transports, and something crossed her face that she immediately and professionally set aside. "Right," she said. "One moment." She allowed it 1 moment, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the ships that had come to take her people home. Then she straightened. "Now can we talk about loading configuration?" Darren almost smiled. "Let's talk about loading configuration." On the 4th day of the evacuation, one of the children asked Darren how old his ship was. Her name was Pia. She was 7 years old and had been born inside the asteroid and had never seen a sky. She was sitting in the Candor's main corridor while her family waited for the loading roster to be called, and she was looking at everything with the particular attention of a person to whom everything is new and equally remarkable. The patched hull plating, the magnetic tool clips, the amber tint on the cockpit viewport. She looked at all of it with the same steady, interested eyes. Older than me, Darren said. Not much older. Is it broken? Parts of it. Then why do you fly it? Darren thought about how to answer this for a moment. Because the broken parts are the ones I fixed myself, he said. And the ones I fixed work better for where I fly than the original ones did. Pia considered this with the seriousness that children apply to things they are genuinely thinking about. Then she nodded once, as though it made complete sense, and went back to looking at the tool clips. The evacuation took 3 weeks in total. It could not be done in one run. The 3 coalition transports had capacity for roughly 3,000 people each in the kind of close-quarters configuration that emergency evacuations required standing capacity, not comfort. Even so, 11,000 people required multiple runs, and each run meant the crossing of the riven expanse twice, out and back. The candor made every crossing. Darren slept in the pilot's seat when he slept at all, and Sophie handled the quiet hours and woke him when the field required attention. Bryn organized the colony side with the methodical energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem all her life. She had the loading rosters ready before the first run completed. She had the priority groups assigned the very young, the very old, those with medical needs, and she had a backup plan for each contingency she could predict and a general principle for the one she could not. When a seeding conflict developed between 2 large families on the second run, she resolved it in 4 minutes with calm authority that left neither family feeling managed. She was 26 years old and had never been anywhere except inside an asteroid in the riven expanse, and she ran a crisis evacuation better than anyone Darren had seen. The coalition transport captains noted this. They did not say so, but they noted it. Morrow went on the second to last run. He had refused to go earlier. The colony leader, he said, was the last to leave after the very young and the very old, after the sick and the workers and the engineers and everyone who was not him. Darren did not argue. He recognized a person who had already decided, and arguing would waste time better spent flying. Before Morrow boarded, Darren walked with him one final time through the parts of the colony that were empty, now the residential chambers, the cultivation bays, the data center where Morrow had handed over the core with 60 years of recorded life on it. The chambers were cold. The power systems that had run for 6 decades were on minimal cycle, just enough to maintain pressure until the last people were gone. Morrow walked through the empty rooms without sentiment, but not without feeling. The feeling was in the set of his shoulders and the pace of his footsteps, and the way he paused in the doorway of the data center for exactly 1 moment before walking on. How many people in the coalition know this was here? Morrow asked as they walked. They will all know, Darren said. Grant is presenting the full report to the Central Council. It will be on record. That we survived, Morrow said. That you thrived, Darren said. 60 years of isolation and 11,000 people. That is not just survival. That is something else. Morrow did not respond to this immediately. They walked out of the empty residential block into the main corridor. Their footsteps echoed. When I was young, Morrow said, there was an old man here, one of the original colonists, who used to say that humans were the most stubborn thing the universe had ever made by accident. He meant it as a complaint. A pause. I always took it as a compliment. The last run out of Farhold happened on day 22. Darren was the final person to leave the asteroid. He walked through the empty docking bay, looked at the lights that were still on the colonists had left them on, a choice Darren had not suggested and assumed was deliberate, and then he boarded the Candor and closed the airlock. They cleared the asteroid perimeter 11 days before the geological survey had estimated the structural interior would become unsafe. Bryn's bracing modifications, installed in the asteroid's internal framework using materials left over from the evacuation, had held the structure together longer than the projections. Not dramatically longer, not enough to change the outcome, just enough to give them margin they had not expected to have. When Darren mentioned this over the comm to her transport, Bryn said, I built in a 15% conservative bias. The models were good, but the local geology is unusual. You accounted for that. I accounted for everything I could account for, she said. And then I added 15%. 11 days later, sensors from the departing fleet recorded the asteroid's interior pressure failing. The settlement that had kept 11,000 people alive across 6 decades went dark without drama, a reading on a sensor screen, a number that changed and then stopped changing. Darren watched it on the display and said nothing, and Sophie said nothing, and that felt like the right response. The coalition hearing was held at Central Station 3 weeks after the fleet's arrival. It was a formal proceeding, with the long, structured dignity that coalition hearings carried: ranked officials, recorded testimony, multiple delegates representing multiple species. Grint presented the full package: the corridor maps, the 60 years of observational data, the engineering records from the colony, the flight logs from the Kandar's 2 crossings of the Expanse. He presented it clearly and credited it correctly, on the record, in the formal transcript. The corridor maps were attributed to the colonists of Farhold. The navigational method was attributed to Darren Holt. The modification principles for coalition vessels were attributed to a joint effort between Farhold's engineering team and the coalition engineers who had worked on the 3 transports. Grint was a pragmatist. Pragmatists give credit when credit is the currency that closes the deal. The hearing voted on 2 resolutions. The first was the restoration of coalition citizenship to all Farhold colonists, with legal recognition backdated to the colony's founding date 60 years prior. It passed with full support. The second was the formal designation of the Riven Expanse Corridor Network as a navigable zone under Farhold Mapping Authority, with full credit and compensation rights assigned to the Farhold colonist community. This one had more debate. It passed. Commander Ural was not at the hearing. He had been reassigned to an administrative posting on a quieter station, which was the coalition's way of handling situations it preferred not to discuss. Mara was given time to speak. He stood at the formal address position, an older man in clothes that were clean but not coalition formal, that were simply the clothes he had, the clothes of Farhold, and he looked at the ranked officials and the delegates and the screens and cameras with the same steady eyes he had used to look at everything else. He did not speak long. He said that when the colony ship had gone into the Expanse 60 years ago, the people on it had known they might not come back. They had gone anyway because that was what humans did. They went toward the difficult thing because someone had to, and they decided it might as well be them. He said that when rescue had not come, they had not stopped being human, had not stopped considering themselves part of a larger family that they happened to be separated from. He said that everything they had built. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and it spread until the whole room was doing it, which was not how coalition hearings typically went. Grint, in his seat, did not clap, but he nodded once, slowly, with the air of a person acknowledging a debt properly recorded. 2 months after the hearing, the coalition offered Darren a contract: lead navigator for Riven Expanse exploration. The Kandar was granted a formal operating license, its 30-day decommission notice formally vacated by the Port Authority, with a brief administrative note that described the original notice as having been issued in error. Darren read this note 3 times and then filed it next to the original decommission warning in a drawer he had for things he found quietly satisfying. He accepted the contract on one condition. Bryn joined as chief engineer. The coalition agreed without extended negotiation, which suggested they had already anticipated the condition. Bryn received the news the way she received most news, by immediately identifying the first 3 problems she would need to solve in the new role and beginning to solve them. She had been living in temporary coalition housing since the evacuation and had already modified the ventilation system in her room because it was running inefficiently. The building's facilities officer had asked her to stop. She had explained the improvement in detail. The officer had listened and then quietly let her continue. On the morning the Kandar was scheduled to depart on the first Expanse exploration run, Darren sat in the pilot's seat and Bryn was in the engineering bay doing something to the port drive housing that involved a sound Darren did not recognize, but which Sophie said was probably fine. "Ready?" Darren asked. "Ask me again in 4 minutes," Bryn said. 4 minutes later she came forward, wiped her hands on a cloth, and settled into the co-pilot seat with the particular ease of a person sitting somewhere they have already decided is theirs. "Ready," she said. "Sophie," Darren said. "Drives are running," Sophie said. "Field ahead is in a low variance phase. Corridor 1 is open. All systems are either functional or have been modified to be functional, which I am choosing to treat as the same thing." A brief pause. "It is good to be going back." The candor lifted from the dock. Below, the station shrank. Ahead, the stars gathered into the particular density that meant the expanse was close. Darren flew. Not because the coalition needed him to. Not because the contract required it. Not because there was a reason that could be written on a form and filed in a drawer. Because the expanse was there, and it had corridors that needed mapping and systems beyond it that had never been reached, and someone had to go first. Humans had always been good at going first. The ship that the galaxy had called broken, that the Port Authority had wanted to scrap, that no inspector had certified and no diplomat had taken seriously, that ship flew into the riven expanse with a human hand on the yoke and came out the other side, the way it always had, the way it always would. Not because it was perfect, because it worked.